You know, I've done my best to avoid covering this particular topic. Not because I don't think it's interesting, but I just think it's unbelievably bloody obvious, right? And secondly, I've never been one to give these celebrities the attention that they so desperately seek and the validation they so desperately want. Um, but yeah, because every few months or so, you'll get a comment like this, particularly from the female actresses, especially from Scarlett Johansson. I believe it's only been a few months since her last comments about the male gaze, and here we are again. And of course, there are a dozen articles out covering her comments. So here we are. Um, this comes from an article published by Variety. Scarlett Johansson says it was socially acceptable for young actresses to be pulled apart for how they looked in the early 2000s. It was tough for Scarlett. Scarlett Johansson told CBS Sunday Morning that the early 2000s were a really harsh time to be a young woman in Hollywood. The Lost in Translation star said during that period it was socially acceptable for female actors to be pulled apart for how they looked. You know, compared to the male stars who have to endure these intense regiments to look a particular way for the roles that before they were given an opportunity. But maybe this was a lot tougher on Scarlett. So let's carry on. It was tough. There was a lot placed on how women looked, Johansson said. What was offered at the time for women my age as far as acting roles or opportunities was much slimmer than it is now. Johansson added that there are much more empowering roles. I cannot read that with a straight face. Here comes female empowerment. There are a lot more empowering roles for a woman in 2026 than when she was in my 20s. When Johansson was coming up in the industry, she said it was slim pickings. You would get really pigeonholed and offered the same roles. It would be like the other woman or the side piece, the bombshell. She said that was the archetype that was prevalent when I was that age. Again, I suppose so unlike the men who were sort of pigeonholed into these action roles and desperately trying to make the transition, or in rom-coms and desperately trying to make the transition into other genres. But it's she had a much more tough time of it, I suppose. Johansson found solace from typecasting in the New York theater scene. Taking a break from Hollywood also taught her to wait for the right role, rather than giving to pressure to work constantly. The right role, and by that I suspect she means something like franchises that men have built up, like Jurassic Park, Ghost in the Shell. It's really interesting what these right roles actually turn out to be. But yeah, I would draw parallels here to, I mentioned a few actors who over the course of their careers have gone through painstaking grueling effort to try to reinvent themselves, right? Jason Momoa comes to mind, although however you may feel about his his acting or his the roles that he's been choosing of late. But I believe he started, or one of his very first roles was actually in Baywatch in 1999. And it's interesting to watch the trajectory of how many cheesy and bad roles, shirtless roles he had to, take on before he could get to like Aquaman status, right? Whereas someone like Scarlett Johansson did a single role and pivoted to stardom. It took Momoa years, decades before he was actually a recognizable Hollywood star. Another one is Alan Richardson, right, who we now know as Jack Reacher. But I remember watching this guy on CW when he was cast, ironically, as Aquaman, right? And I believe Reacher, when he started shooting Reacher, he was maybe 38, 39. So these men had to spend decades building and building, taking these, and I think he played Hawk as well, the DC character in Titans, and I actually enjoyed him in that. not so much his Aquaman, but it took him decades of taking these roles and staying these two men staying in ridiculous shape, which can't be easy, right? And pushing and pushing just to get that star power, and these women who have and you know, as I said, there are every generation sort of has their own Scarlett Johansson, right? You have Jessica Alba before Scarlett Johansson came on the scene, just as insufferable as she was, shocking. Um, and then Scarlett Johansson, and then this generation has Millie Alcock as their, you know, empowered female that will be, you know, she came out recently with her own comments about the ownership of the female body. So every generation seems to have their own version of these insufferable women to deal with. But again, their male counterparts have to shut up, stay in shape, continually work on themselves and build their bodies and their acting skills and their resume until that time comes for them to actually, you know, reach that star status. But poor Scarlett, right? Uh, she goes on to say, it's something that I learned over time, but it's hard. She explained that once you start working, you really feel like every job is going to be your last, and that if you get opportunities to work, you have to keep taking them, even though they might not be as varied as the jobs that really give you pleasure. She continued, every actor feels like that because it is so competitive, and I think once you do have the spotlight, you want to keep it on you. I mean, that's the instinct, I think, for a young actor or any actor. Johnson was just 17 years old when she made her breakout debut in Sofia Coppola's 2003 drama Lost in Translation. So her career got shot to stardom at just 17 years old. I believe Momoa was cast when got cast in the Baywatch role when he was 19. I'm not sure what age Alan Richardson was in his role in Smallville, but after Smallville, he was largely forgotten for decades. Right, he popped up here and there, but no one really took note of him again until much later. And same for Jason Momoa. So these men didn't shoot to stardom until their early to late 30s. Meanwhile, Scarlett Johansson, just 17, a single role got her foot in the door, and her career took off. I think it's really sad, right? Because what we can see happening here is these women have been bombarded with this message for decades and decades that they need to compete with men, right? And towards the end of it, the form that takes is just jealousy, right? She speaks here about the right role and the jobs that really give her pleasure, and it is jealousy because they've been fed this message for decades and decades that they are equal to men, and then she gets to that point in her career where the roles that she once did get are no longer coming in, and she's recognized that she has still not been able to achieve the things that other actors, other A-list actors, male A-list actors have. Let's be frank here. Scarlett Johansson's name will never be mentioned in the same line as Daniel Day-Lewis. And I say it's unfortunate because these women have just been fed a lie. And what awaits them, unfortunately, at the end of this road is just obscurity. So I do feel for them. Not the snobbish rhetoric that she's pushing about the male gaze, because if not for the male gaze, she would not have made it in the door in the first place. I think the question that the question at the end of this road for a lot of these women will be, and she sort of alludes to that in her comments here, is there a place for women in these in entertainment that doesn't include them being the bombshell, right? Is there a place for female characters like that? And the unfortunate truth is not the focal character. That's the real answer that no one wants to give these women. Not as the focal character. I think whenever you find women in these particular positions, these roles and characters that they play, more often than not, they have to take on these masculine characteristics in order to play these roles. You see that in her character in Jurassic World, even in Black Widow, she has to be a combatant, right? She has to do these things that otherwise men would be doing, and she's finding that they're not satisfactory. And the unfortunate truth that, again, no one wants to talk about is that there's never going to be a scenario where Scarlett Johansson is going to be the star of The Revenant, where she's spending days out into in a blizzard, hiding in an animal carcass to get that Oscar. You never hear these stories from women. But Leonardo DiCaprio did it, and he won the Oscar. He won his Oscar for that, deservedly so. But whenever you do hear about these feats that men have to push themselves, these lengths that they have to go to achieve this perfection, to perfect the craft, you never hear these stories from women. At most, you'll hear that they were told on set that they had to tuck in their stomach, or someone looked at them the wrong way, and woe is me. So that is the unfortunate truth. Yes, there is a place for women in cinema. However, by attempting to place women in these focal roles as protagonists, more often than not, you end up giving them these masculine characteristics, which unfortunately makes them snobbish and unlikable. These characteristics in men exude confidence and competence. In a woman, not so much. and you can see that in a character like Miss Marvel, right? And how she came across and why she was so unlikable. Men are not interested in women acting like men, and women have no interest in women acting like men. So you'll continue to run into this wall where you're trying to please an audience that does not exist. And you're trying to shoehorn women into these roles that they were frankly not equipped to fill. So these women can exist in cinema, in important roles. Yes, I cannot, I acknowledge that. But it really, the majority really should be in a supporting role. One good example of that, I think, is Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer, right? Where Emily Blunt gave a fantastic performance, not in the leading role, but in her character as Oppenheimer's wife. It was not entirely traditional, based on what was happening and how they met and all of that, but she did play the traditional but flawed wife to Oppenheimer, but also the vindictive woman who refused to shake the hand of Oppenheimer's colleague who didn't defend him during the trials, and that was a brilliant scene. Or that scene where she was the one being interviewed in that room, and she managed to sway the men who were trying to destroy her husband. It's that sort of charm in those supportive roles that people find memorable. And so when Scarlett asks, is there about scenes or roles for women outside of just being a bombshell, I would point to something like Oppenheimer, because I think that was done relatively well. It's interesting that people give Christopher Nolan so much flack for supposedly not writing women well, which I wholeheartedly disagree with, because that is how it's done. He's not trying to force these masculine characteristics on these women, because he recognizes what the importance of their role in the stories that he tells. So again, I think this is an unfortunate trend that we're seeing with a lot of these female actresses coming out and bashing the male gaze, the very thing that has catapulted their career to stardom. Women want they want it both ways. They want the benefit of the male gaze, but simultaneously be victims to it. And it's one or the other. You cannot have both, right? And as I said, the only thing that awaits them at the end of this road is unfortunately going to be obscurity. All right, guys, that is it. I promise this would be a short one, so we'll end it there. Thanks very much for stopping by, and I'll see you for the next one.